I'd like to move on to some of your previous work, which my understanding is that it focused less on straight history compared to Zealot, and more sort of on describing some of the intersections between religion and politics, this notably in How to Win a Cosmic War, which is also called Beyond Fundamentalism. Now, in that book, you draw a very clear distinction between two of the words we hear sort of bandied about, Islamism and jihadism.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because these are words that are thrown around a lot. Islamist, jihadist, you hear these terms all the time, and I think sometimes they're interchangeable in the minds of a lot of people, but they mean vastly different things. Islamism is a political philosophy. It's religious nationalism of the Islamic variety. Religious nationalism, of course, is not just a Muslim thing. We have Christian nationalism here in the United States, Jewish nationalism in Israel, we have Hindu nationalism in India. Islamism is just a version of nationalism that believes that the state should be founded upon religious principles, in this case, Islamic principles. But did you notice what I keep saying over and over again? The key word to understanding Islamism is nationalism. An Islamist is a nationalist, is someone who believes in the nation states, wants to focus on his nationalistic identity. An Egyptian Islamist is different than a Tunisian Islamist. It's different than a Lebanese Islamist. These are people who care only about their countries. They have a vision for their nation state, a vision founded upon religious principles, and that's what they want to do. A jihadist is the actual opposite of an Islamist. A jihadist is not just not a nationalist, he's an anti-nationalist. Jihadism is a global ideology. It wants to remove all nation states, remove all borders, remove all nationalistic and ethnic boundaries as being opposed to Islam. Jihadists want to create a global order. And so a group like Al-Qaeda is a jihadist organization. A group like the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist organization. In the popular American imagination, these two guys are the same. You know, you're a member of Al-Qaeda, you're a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, you're the same. In reality, not only are they the opposites, but they loathe each other. They spend most of their time fighting each other, not fighting anybody else.
What you're describing as jihadism is something that's in fact very modern, that could really only exist in the world of technology.
Absolutely, Mary. I mean, look, Islamism is an old idea. It's been around for 50, 60 years. Been around ever since, you know, the end of colonialism, really, in the Middle East. Jihadism is brand new. This is born of globalization. It's born of the modern world. It's a modern idea. If you believe in globalization, then you understand where jihadists come from, because they believe the same thing, but just a weird and violent version of that.
I imagine that you've followed the recent changes in Iranian politics very closely. So what do you make of the what seems to be a turnaround in the relationship between the Iranian government and the U.S. and even the West at large?
Well, look, these conversations are just starting. They're going to take a long time. There's a lot of mistrust on both sides, a lot of skepticism, and a lot of reason to not be necessarily optimistic that this will go anywhere. But I think that we do have an opportunity here. There is a difference in these conversations that we haven't seen before. A different emphasis both on the American side and on the Iranian side. The path is before us for a breakthrough, not just in the nuclear negotiations, but for a kind of rapprochement between the United States and Iran. But it's going to require patience, diligence, and let's be frank, there are people on both sides who do not want this negotiation to succeed. There are vested interests in the United States, as in the Islamic Republic of Iran, who actually benefit from this ongoing distrust, this ongoing conflict between the Iranians and the Americans, and will do everything in their power to keep negotiations from succeeding. They cannot be allowed to succeed.
And meanwhile, you have Israel who's saying, you know, wait, nothing has changed.
That's one of the vested interests that I'm referring to. I mean, Israel, for its own domestic reasons, does not want to see any kind of rapprochement between the U.S. And Iran, but that's also true of Saudi Arabia. I mean, oftentimes I think when people talk about the obstacles in the way of Iranian and American engagement, Israel always comes up because that's an easy one. It's front and center. But what is a far greater obstacle to American and Iranian rapprochement is Saudi Arabia. After all, we get 60% of our foreign oil from Saudi Arabia. Iran sits on the second largest supply of natural gas and oil on the planet. A warming of ties between the Americans and the Iranians would be very bad for the Saudi bottom line, and they have done everything in their power over the last 3 decades to make sure that that never happens, and they are working hard to continue to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Most people would say that the most pressing issue in the Middle East these days is Syria. What would you like to see happen there?
What I think the American administration has decided is that they prefer to see Bashar al-Assad stay in power than deal with what comes next, which is why you don't hear anyone in the Obama administration speaking the way that they were speaking 18 months ago, talking about Assad's days are numbered, that he needs to be removed from office. It's been a long time since anyone at the State Department made that kind of message or presented that kind of message when it comes to Syria. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that we waited too long, I think, for a truly robust response to this conflict, and now the conflict has taken on a life of its own, and I really do not see anything positive coming out of it. On the contrary, I see very easily how it can spread beyond the borders, absorb Jordan, absorb Lebanon, and become a truly uncontrollable regional conflict with devastating consequences. I wish I could be somewhat optimistic or positive about Syria, but it's very hard to be so.
Another violent hotspot these days is Egypt. The recent months have seen unforeseen violence there, with the Egyptian military seeming to have taken the view that the secular government should be the way forward there. Did the brief experiment with having Islamists in power in Egypt, is that a failure? Does that show that Islamist governments, can't really work within a democratic system?
Islamism comes in many stripes, and it's been quite successful in other places. The problem, however, in Egypt isn't the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the way in which the military responded to the corruption and the ineptitude of the Muslim Brotherhood by a absolutely anti-democratic coup that will lead to nothing more than another police state. What we have in Egypt today is far worse than the worst of the Mubarak era. The members of the Muslim Brotherhood are being slaughtered on the street. Their spiritual leaders are being arrested and tortured in prison. What you have is a war zone. I think that what you're going to see a year from now is the worst of Egypt. And that is going to be laid at the feet of those so-called Democrats who paved the way for that military coup because of their hatred of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Would you say that Turkey is sort of the way forward, where you have if not an Islamist party, certainly an Islamist-based party that's working within the confines of a strong secular system?
It's certainly the most successful example of an Islamist government. And really, the thing about Islamism is that there are two ways to deal with religious nationalism of any kind, whether it's Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu. It really doesn't matter. You could either give it a seat at the table, give it an opportunity to present its ideas in the open marketplace, and give people a chance to vote for their ideas, and then give them an opportunity to put those ideas into practice. If they're successful, then wonderful. In a democratic situation, they get voted into office. If there's a failure, they get voted out of office. Or you could repress it. And when you repress it, you radicalize it. That has always been the case. It was the case in Algeria. It was the case in Egypt. Indeed, what we refer to as Al-Qaeda started by a group of oppressed Islamists who decided that the national path was no longer the way to go, that global domination was the right way to go. And you're seeing that now. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which laid down its guns, picked up ballots, played by the system, played by the rules, did what it was told, was successful, and then instead of being voted out of office, was massacred, is about to become the next Al-Qaeda.
All right, thanks so much, Reza Aslan. Thanks for making time for us here at WorldDenver Talks.
Thank you for having me.